You're listening to the Australian Hunting and Beyond podcast with Matt, where we talk about hunting, shooting, fishing, camping, and everything else that the great outdoors has to offer. Let's get into it. Okay, listeners, you know my stance on 1080, so I'm super excited about the conversation and the guests that we have today, because if you pay attention over in New Zealand across the ditch, there has been some amazing work going on over there in regards to 1080 by two people. However, we've only got one with us here today, but we've got Clyde Graf, one half of the Graf boys, joining us. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Matt. Yes, from over here in New Zealand. Happy to be with you.
Firstly, really appreciate you coming on the show, because you are quite I guess you've got a lot of experience with 1080 and some amazing documentaries and short films. I believe you've won a couple of awards for those as well.
That's right, yeah, over the years, yeah.
And going through them, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep posting. If you're out there and you haven't seen them, I'm going to put them on my Facebook page, and I'm going to share them throughout so you can jump on and see the links. Instagram's a bit funny, won't let me do it as well. But, geez, it's a bit of an eye-opener watching your docos and seeing some of the things that go on. Compared to what we get told about 1080, there is a big disparity in the information.
Well, there is, and it's usually because it's an industry. Poisoning is an industry. There's a lot of money involved. And unfortunately, introduced animals are classed as the viable target. And that's what happens in New Zealand. It's happened for a long time. My brother and I, Steve, and our father, who just passed away this year, but we've been producing hunting videos in New Zealand here since 1997. And our first video was called Hunting for a Living, and it was a big sort of hit. We progressed through a lot of other videos selling in Australia as well over the years. We even had Hunting and Fishing New Zealand produce a roaring machine, which sold in Australia as well. So, yeah, we were involved for a long time in the hunting scene. And then in, I think it was 2006, some people from Taupo in New Zealand here were concerned about 1080 poison use, and they asked Steve and I, we were invited to an evening, and they asked Steve and I if we'd do a documentary on the use of poisoning in New Zealand. So we produced our first documentary in 2006, which was called A Shadow of Doubt. It played twice on Maori television over here, which is a independent channel, I guess, and was well received. Then a couple of years later, 2008, I think, we were filming in the Kahurangi National Park, Fiordland, and we came across native bird, the weka, consuming a possum carcass, and there'd been an aerial 1080 poison drop. And over here in New Zealand, they spread the poison in cereal food from helicopters, and they drop it all across the forests and all across the waterways. And it kills everything that eats it, but unfortunately possums, well, that's the target. Possums, rats are the targets. Deer, pigs, goats. Goats to a lesser extent uptake the poison, but deer, 90% of the populations are wiped out. And so anyway, we're filming that, and so we decided, jeepers, we're meant to be saving the wildlife, not poisoning them with secondary poisoning, because 1080 causes secondary poisoning in the wildlife that it kills. So we produced Poisoning Paradise in 2009, released that. It won several awards overseas. No television station in New Zealand would play it. It was too controversial. And we've been an enemy of the state ever since. And so our hunting career, or, sponsorships and things went out the door. And since then, we just thought, look, no one else really has the experience in filming out there in New Zealand forests and the effort that it takes, because it's rugged country, a lot of it's rugged. We have a lot of experience, and so we thought we'd better just do the right thing and sort of try to show people and the government and the communities what's going on with these aerial operations. And I'm afraid none of it's good. And it continues to this day, and in fact, it's growing. So that's just a brief introduction.
Yeah, so look, on that, I've got a heap of questions to go through, and watching some of the docos, you've got some great footage of a variety of animals consuming the 1080 baits that have just been dumped. And one of the ones I really enjoyed, I can't remember which one it was on, but you overlaid the waterways over the map of where they dumped 1080 in the aerial dropping. And geez, there were some waterways in it. So, and that links back to some of your documentaries. Like you had one on trout being mass poisoned.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the ones I looked at was when the eels were eating the possums in the water. And that was the other thing, the amount of dead animals in streams that had died from 1080. And even the pellets and having, freshwater crayfish eating them. Like it just seems never ending. And there's so much bycatch going on.
Yeah. So firstly, the waterways you mentioned there. So in New Zealand, there's rainfall, a lot of rainfall. So the waterways are flowing all year round. And when the aerial operations are undertaken, there is, in almost all aerial operations, there are no buffers to the waterways because there's a waterway every 100 metres kind of thing. It's just over every little hill and every little gully, there's water flowing. It's too difficult, and the Department of Conservation and the agencies that use the poison admit that it's too difficult to buffer the waterways. They can't buffer them and then hit the land areas effectively without including everything. So they poison the waterways as well. Incidentally, the American warning label, which is on our website, which is tv-wild.com, has a lot of information about 1080, including flight charts and things, and warning labels. The warning label from America states that 1080, they only use a little bit of poison in America, but when it's used, all animal carcasses must be recovered, and they must be buried half a mile away from any waterway and 3 feet deep, and preferably on the person who used the poison's property, no one else's. So in America, they have very strong regulations around the poison. They only use 6 teaspoons a year, very, very small amount. New Zealand uses around a ton of pure poison. So in regard to the waterways, they have very strong regulations. In New Zealand, they drop the baits directly into the waterways. The animals are poisoned. They fall directly into the waterways when they die, some of them, and they are left to decompose in the waterways, and they're toxic themselves. So the animal's toxic, the baits are toxic, and they just break down in the water. I'm a elected member of Waikato Regional Council here in New Zealand. This is my second term. I raise this issue, but it's like, talking to a brick wall, because in New Zealand, so many people are brainwashed into believing that it's a safe poison when it clearly isn't. So in regard to the animals, you mentioned the animals, it kills 80% of the deer, 92% of the deer population. A lot of rats, a lot of possums are killed, and those carcasses are left to decompose where they fall and often into the waterways. So it's quite an obscene practice, and if the world could see what was going on, they'd be absolutely shocked. They wouldn't believe it. It would be unbelievable, and yet it's happening more and more in this country every year.
That's where I got in touch with you. I've been over here and doing my best to sort of try and raise awareness about what is happening, because we're facing a couple of things here where there's just been a National Feral Deer Action Plan that has been released earlier this year. And on the back of that, a couple of weeks ago, there has been the release of a feral goat abatement plan. And both of them especially the goat plan is referencing the deer plan a lot. And the deer plan was very vague in using poison, but it was one of the main pushes is that they would develop or get approved a poison to be used. And now in this goat plan, they're basically saying that that's sort of, they're alluding to the fact that we should be poisoning as well, and it's an easy way to bring it across. And they've developed things called the aggregator, which is basically like a bait station that has a grid so that certain non-target species won't be able to access the actual trap and feed. I'm a bit skeptical on that. And then you can also talk about how, I guess, other animals can feed on the corpses of the dead ones because they're not being taken away. So there's multiple elements that are impactful to the environment and to the animals on the landscape. Now, interestingly, over here, our own Western Australian government has published basically about 1080 saying that the further I guess, towards the eastern seaboard, the higher the rate of intolerance to the bait that native animals do have. But they stopped at South Australia, which I'm not sure if you know much about Australia. It's right in the middle, I guess, when you compare western and eastern sides, and that's where they stopped. So there was a real large disparity between how much tolerance an animal could have in Western Australia versus South Australia, the same species. And then they stopped there. They didn't go any further. And I'm guessing that's probably because the tolerance comes because a lot of the plants that they use to derive the poison are from Western Australia. Do you know much about Australia, Clyde?
I've lived in Australia for a number of years over the years, but it's been 25 years since I lived there. So in the last year or so, since my father's been dying, I've been back about 5 times. I'm heading back again next week. I hope to come back to Australia to live full time. So if there's any opportunities for hunting shows or anything out there, Steve and I'd be keen to get into that. So I'll put that out there. But yes, we spend a bit of time in Australia. But in regard to tolerance of animals, the toxicity of the poison being used is far greater than any animal would be able to tolerate anyway. So I think it's just not, I don't believe it's accurate. The other thing that's concerning is a lot of the bureaucrats may have good intentions, but I think they're being misled. So, for example, if they're getting information from New Zealand with regard to 1080, they need to be very careful about how they interpret it or how they accept it, because in Australia you have a lot of wildlife that will scavenge, a lot of native endemic wildlife that will scavenge poisoned carcasses, poisoned animals, and it's going to be extremely dangerous to that wildlife to be using 1080 in any form. Now, bait stations, we talk about bait stations being targeted. So it is targeted to the animal they're trying to kill, but once that animal is killed, it is then a poisoned bait for a predator or a scavenger. And so that's the risk. And of course, 1080 poison, including the contaminated carcasses, are toxic to insects as well. Birds that scavenge insects, any animal that consumes, I'm not sure of all your animals over there, but I know there's a lot that would go for that, for the animals. So it surprises me that they'll consider it, because deer, for example, are a big animal, and when they consume enough poison to kill them, they become a very big poison bait laying in the hills somewhere. And there's a lot of deer. Now, I do agree that you need a deer action plan over there, because the deer population is increasing in a lot of areas. And I love deer. I love to see them. A lot of people like the deer. Some farmers don't like the deer so much because their crops may be impacted. But look, deer are only having one young a year, or half a young a year. It depends on your population. And they are, well, you've got big country there, but in regard to farming, shooting is the way. Culling, over here in New Zealand, it was very successful to export venison to other countries, and so a private enterprise was a good way to go. And that's something that maybe you could look at over there, that maybe they have. Pigs over there have been sold for years. I don't know if they still are, but when you start bringing in poison, that eliminates that private enterprise opportunity, and it limits food sources. So that's the risk there. But I do think you're going to have to do something with the deer. But I think, hunters on the ground is a good way to start.
Yeah, look, I am in agreement. I think that my position on it is that we need to keep numbers in check, just like anything. Any species needs to have numbers kept in check to, maximise the quality of animals, maximise their health, the spread of disease, the, starvation. There's so many elements to it. I think we do it very poorly in this country at the moment, that we are looking and fixated on going down the poison route or the aerial culling, which is just shooting and letting them rot. And I think that there is far more opportunity, and one of the things I think we definitely don't do very well. I'm from New South Wales. So one of the things I see is we have a lot of national parks where people don't really go off the trails. And that's the perfect opportunity to open them up for hunting. You know, if we're talking about baiting in deer, there's no reason we can't, instead of paying for, instead of using taxpayers' money, there's no reason that we can't be setting up bait stations and have people knock them off at night for thermal and harvest the meat. There's so many opportunities that we could use that don't involve poison. Yes, it might take some infrastructure. Yes, it might take some jobs, but isn't that a really good thing for the economy as opposed to just dumping a heap of poison into the environment? Like, that just really concerns me. And you mentioned just a moment ago about the animals that are poisoned becoming massive toxic baits. That's one thing when I talked about the feral deer action plan that really concerned me, is that if an animal eats the bait and then the latency, because the poison doesn't directly kill them straight away, it can take some time. You as a hunter could just be super unlucky, harvest that animal straight away, not know about it, and all of a sudden you could be eating that toxic animal.
We had the same thing happen here. What was interesting about it was that, for example, there was a family in Pataruru. This is probably 4 years ago, and they became violently ill and went to hospital and were in comas. While they were in hospital, they were having convulsions, violent convulsions, and they needed a lot of hospital staff to hold them down. They were in hospital in comas for about 3 weeks. Comas for 3 weeks. Because 1080 poison over here is considered to be the saviour of wildlife instead of the killer of wildlife, the media got hold of this story and put out what I call false information about it, and claimed that the 3 family members had suffered a poisoning from botulism. So look, we've got 3 video clips on our YouTube channel there, and on the tv-wild.com site, which goes into this poisoning. And what happened was, we've interviewed the family themselves. They did survive miraculously, but what had happened is they were sold or delivered a wild pig that had died, that had been poisoned with 1080. They consumed a small amount of it in their meal, and like you say, the latency period, so there's a few hours latency, which means they don't feel the effects of the poison. A few hours later, they felt the effects. All of them passed out, and it was quite a mess after that. The ambulances turned up and they were taken to hospital, and they were in there for a long time. But the media stuck to the story of botulism. So we've got the 3 interviews regarding that case. And then there's also a case with Professor Ian Shaw for Canterbury University, who explains that it wasn't botulism, it was most likely 1080, which we know it is 1080. But it was an interesting case because the media wouldn't let go, the government, the health authorities wouldn't let go. They wouldn't want to admit that it was 1080 poisoning. But the point you raise is that yes, there is that risk for people to harvest the animals, and they could well be poisoned or sublethally poisoned. And this poison there is no antidote for 1080 for a fatal dose, and you don't want a sublethal dose either. It's pretty awful. So, but look, I think Australia is at a crossroads at the moment. You're in a position where you can assess the way to manage your deer populations, and if you go down the 1080 poison route, what will happen is it'll become a big industry, and a lot of money will go into funding science, and I would call it junk science, that will try to support that 1080 poison is a good thing for killing deer when it simply isn't. It's unacceptable because it's inhumane to start with, the way that the animals die. But because of its persistence in the environment, because it's toxic after it kills, it goes on and on. So it's something that must not be chosen as a method of animal control in Australia, in my opinion. So hopefully you're at the crossroad where you can decide that, yes, we must not go down that route like New Zealand has. We've got too many native wildlife that are going to be affected. We've got too many people living in areas where, their pets will be poisoned, and, the consequences are going to be too big. So I hope that you do choose the right path. But my warning is, if you get the wrong people in charge, they will produce science to support their so-called science, to support their agenda. That's the risk.
So I think on that, I've sort of been very vocal on that, is that you can manipulate data to show what you would like. And we've already got that. So they already use 1080 over here for wild dogs and foxes. And there is a lot of anecdotal evidence about farmers and people losing pet dogs and things like that because something might have grabbed a bait and dropped it in a backyard or the like. So that's already concerning, that the precedent has sort of been set and that the big push is there. One of my big concerns, not just for the animal welfare, but from a hunting perspective, is that, over in New Zealand, the EPA themselves, and this is coming from the epa.gov NZ. I've got the link and I'm happy to share it with anyone that wants to have a read. But on their own site here, the New Zealand Food Safety Authority is saying that you should not basically take wild or game estate animals from an area that has had 1080 for at least 4 months after the operation has ended, or 2 months after the operation has ended and after 100 millimeters of rainfall. That to me is very, very concerning, in that if that is our own governing bodies are saying this and then it is still being actioned and put out into the landscape, it just seems like a recipe for disaster that's just waiting to happen.
That's on the light side as well, in my opinion. It used to be 6 months. And as far as walking your dog through a 1080 poisoned area, you shouldn't do it within 12 months. Because the animal carcasses, a poisoned possum even, let alone a deer, but a poisoned possum, their bones are toxic to dogs. And so a very small amount of poison will kill a dog. So there's many tragic stories in this country. Hundreds of dogs in some years are poisoned every year, pet dogs, and in this country, yeah. So it's the EPA, it's a funny situation because what we're starting to notice here in New Zealand, the medical officer of health is someone that used to have to sign off the 1080 poison drops. They used to have to say, yes, we'll approve that, and you can drop it as long as you tell the locals and a few of the notifications are followed, etc. However, they've pulled back now. They're no longer signing the poison drops off, and so we've got a case here in New Zealand where no agency seems to want to sign it off anymore. So we're starting to think that maybe they're getting the message that this stuff is really causing problems. The poison's dropped, as I said, directly into all the waterways. A lot of the time, people downstream aren't even informed that the poison's being dropped in their water, let alone poisoned animal carcasses falling into the streams. And they're drawing water for months that's contaminated with pathogens, and they're not sure why they're getting sick because no one's informed them. And that's a fact. No one informs them about the possibility of toxic carcasses in waterways in this country at all, apart from me and my brother. And it astounds me the way our councils continue to ignore it. But, that's over here in New Zealand. Australia, let's hope you guys are not going down that line. You don't have as much water over there, as much running, in all your valleys and stuff. I suppose you do in some of the forests. But I can promise you it's no good for native wildlife.
Well, that's what is really interesting, watching a lot of your documentaries, and a target species being possums. Obviously, they're not native over there, but they are here. That worries me because are they going to be bycatch, and are we not looking at already what's happening with 1080 here and really studying if our natives are impacted? Are we just sort of sweeping it under the rug and saying, oh, yeah, we're just going to use it? The other one, so I briefly talked about the feral goat abatement plan. And again, look, sometimes I take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt, but there's a ban1080.org.au, and one of the things they say about 1080 poison is that goats can die up to 7 days after ingesting it. Now, that one for me is very interesting because the the markets mustering them up and selling them has sort of dropped, so they're not worth as much money, and it seems like an opportune time to try and wipe as many off the landscape as possible. And I think this is where, the pushback from farmers previously, when they were worth quite good money, would have been high, whereas now they're not really worth that much money. So a lot of farmers don't want them on the landscape competing for food. they're pushing the 1080 as the option there for goats. But that concerns me because I eat goat, more than happy to go out and shoot a goat and eat it. But then if it's in an area which has been baited for 1080, if this does get through, having it up to 7 days afterwards, that's just, again, as I said, it's a recipe for disaster, but it's really concerning. And I feel that it's being overlooked at how many people eat game meat, and then also the contribution that hunters do for the economy. Here in New South Wales, we were, I think, 4th highest on the last data that came out from the DPI, or Department of Primary Industries. So there's more to it than just the poisoning of animals. There's so many flow-on effects which will be impacted if some of these things get through.
Do you eat pigs over there in Oz? Wild pigs?
Look, a lot of people do eat wild pig, depending on the locality, because they are, depending where. I personally wouldn't, only in the fact, especially from like sort of out west, because they definitely eat a lot of carrion and things like that.
Absolutely.
However, a few people I know do eat it, especially if they know where it's coming from, if it's coming off a good crop and things like that, because they feel it's a bit safer. So like each to their own regarding that. But I definitely know there's an issue watching some of your videos that pigs consume it as well. And my big one was, which sort of shocked me a little bit, was how many livestock like cows that would consume the bait. And, that has to be a concern for farmers, which isn't being pushed out there by the government or the organisations that are trying to push for the poison.
So over here, the delivery system is cereal baits. Now, 2.5 baits, it's reported, will kill a human being. 12-gram baits, which are, just nice. You'll see some of them in our videos, the size of the baits. But cattle beasts, we found some research in America that showed that 2.5 baits will kill a 400-kilo cattle beast. So every year there's non-target species killed in this country with oversprays where they make mistakes, and it kills livestock. Generally, what happens when livestock is killed in New Zealand, it's kept quiet. You'll see videos of us talking to farmers, etc., where they're paid to keep quiet, and they don't want that information out into the public arena. And but it's a common occurrence, and it's an issue as well. So, but it's the delivery method that we're talking about here. So, how, if they're going to poison deer, for example, is it going to be aerial drops with cereal bait? If it is, there's other wildlife that's going to eat it. I can't see how they're going to target deer. I can't see how they're going to target goats without by-kill. And, if it's like New Zealand, you go into a virgin area, you get a lot of dead animals and birds. The issue we also have here is that say they're targeting the possums and the rats, but it's killing the kiwi. Kiwi are known to eat the baits directly. Kiwi, they eat the baits. They also eat things that have been poisoned, like freshwater crayfish in the streams, or mice even. But not just kiwi. There's a lot of native birds that eat the baits directly. They eat the carrion, the dead animals you talk about. There's a lot of birds in New Zealand that eat insects and get poisoned because the insects are fed on the poison baits or the dust that's left in the forest. This has all been researched to some degree. In my opinion, the research has got poorer and poorer, and I've got scientists backing us up on this. We interview scientists that have looked into all this research. And unfortunately, as you know how it works, the funding is usually by the industries that want to pursue the money, and they get science to back them up. And in New Zealand, most of it's junk science. And we're seeing in areas that are repeatedly poisoned, the demise of native species. Some areas where the poison's repeatedly used, the kiwi are now eradicated. We look at areas where the poison's never used, and there's very few of those now, but if we look at those areas, the bird life's doing great. There's the odd deer, the odd pig. It's a fantastic forest where the poison is left, where there's no poison. But it's a hard battle because it's $100 million a year, at least $100 million here in New Zealand spent on poisoning. There's enough poison spread across our forests to kill over 60 million people every year across our forests and waterways. So it's big business, but we're starting to see more and more aquifers, contaminated aquifers. Now, no one's saying what it is, but the aquifers, you'll see like even Queenstown was shut down for 6 weeks or something. The aquifers there because they were contaminated. Hawke's Bay, same thing. Other areas around the country, aquifers. Why is this? New Zealand's meant to have the cleanest, water in the world, rah, rah, rah. Why are the aquifers being contaminated? And in my opinion, it's more and more poisons are just they're dropping so much poison, so much contamination. So it's not surprising. And I think we'll see a lot more of it. So I'll just put that out there.
I liked one of the videos, which was deer mass poisoned at Lake Taupo. The farmer speaks out. And one of the images you had on screen talked about that the manufacturer's recommendations are about not putting it in the waterways like we were just sort of talking about, and that if any animals that have been poisoned and died have to be removed and burnt or buried at a landfill for hazardous waste.
Correct.
Now, look, that starts ringing alarm bells straight away. If that's coming from the manufacturer, how's it getting through? Like, I understand it's an industry, but for me, we have our animal rights activists over here, and I'm sure you do over there as well. But this should be sort of common ground that we should all be up in arms against, saying, for animal welfare, it's a terrible way for an animal to die. Secondly, for an animal to be left on the landscape when the manufacturer themselves is saying, don't do it, this is how you should be disposed of the animal. But we're turning a blind eye to that and saying, we'll just drop it anyway and it'll be fine. Just play on.
Look, it's bizarre. We pull our hair out. We can't understand what's really going on. But then we drill down into it a little bit. And if you look, and this is public knowledge, you can look this up yourself into the company's office here in New Zealand. The government actually owns the poison factory that imports 1080. The government owns this factory. The government owns the factory that produces the baits. It's a state-owned enterprise, and they run it to make profit. It seems bizarre. As you talked about animal rights, well, you've got like the Forest and Bird organisation over here in New Zealand. They support 1080. And it's like, how can Forest and Birds, they go back to the 1980s, we have information that suggests that Forest and Bird never supported 1080 because they knew how toxic it was to the birds they love. These days, they support the use of 1080 because they support Department of Conservation, and in our opinion, they're getting funding or they're getting some kickback from the use of it. But there's this, incestuous link all through New Zealand. The media, everything seems to be feeding off this hysteria about poisoning. I think it's an anti-life kind of thing. There's a new program going on here in New Zealand, which is called Predator Free 2050. Where they hope to get rid of all rats, mice, probably deer, but every introduced animal by 2050. And a big part of that is just saturating the place in poison. It doesn't even make sense. It's not possible. The areas that they have done, like, for example, there's an area in the bottom of the South Island. It's called Ulver Island. It's only a small area. I can't quite think of it. It might be like 5,000 hectares. Off the top of my head, I don't know. It's a small island. It's been airily poisoned with brodifacoum, another poison, but similar sort of thing. It's an anticoagulant, ugly killer, but it's the same sort of thing. They just saturate the area, kill everything on it, and then hope that they've got them all. Well, it's just been re-poisoned for the third time over the last 15 years because of re-invasions. You see, what I'm getting at is they try to get rid of all the predators and the pests and the introduced animals, and all they end up doing is killing the native wildlife, eradicating that, and they just never seem to be able to get there. They want to eradicate the whole of New Zealand. It's like, that's insanity to even think such a thing. But it's big bucks. It's $1 billion, goodness knows how much it is into the future. It's big money. And it seems to me that's what this is all about. It's a big industry. It seems crazy. They've fantasized the country into believing that it can be done. And New Zealand's a small country. It's easy to control the media. It doesn't take much money really to get influence in the media. And the media is that's the window to people's minds. And, 15, 20 years of bombardment of propaganda in regard to this. And it's worked, unfortunately. There's a big area, a lot of people in New Zealand that are aware, but there's a lot of work to be done to raise more awareness. But as I said, the government owns the factory that imports the poison and distributes it. So we're up against the wall there.
Two things about what you just mentioned is back to the feral goat abatement plan. Part of that plan is influencing the public basically of why goats need to be completely removed from the landscape, taken out and whatnot. So essentially it's the propaganda of being able to convince people that don't know, so painting it in one way. And the goat abatement plan, there was, I think, hunters were mentioned once, maybe twice in the document. Then we go back to the feral deer action plan, and very limited use of hunters was in there. It was all mainly professional shooters culling out of helicopters. But what they did mention is when they changed it, because there was such a big outcry from hunters and saying, we should be part of the solution. What they basically did was talk about how hunters waste time and aren't as effective because they might stop to take meat off the animal instead of just shooting them and leaving them there to lay down. Now, one of my arguments has always been, if we're talking about just shooting and leaving, that it's going to contribute to the pest population, because the other pests on the landscape are going to have a viable food source, which just makes it worse. It does seem very crazy when you sort of take a step back and look at this and go, should we be doing this? Should we be going, as you sort of mentioned, the idea of completely eradicating any introduced species is damn near impossible. At some stage, I think we need to be a bit more pragmatic and go, okay, they're on the landscape. Yes, we need to keep the numbers to a minimum or within a certain amount, but what are the options for this? What could potentially be a resource, and use them and view them as such, because that potentially can give money back to the economy. It could also create jobs and even feed families, because I don't know over there how your economy is going, but over here, our interest rates keep going up. We're paying more and more money for just to survive over here, and people are feeling the pinch. The fact that we're even talking about dumping poison for game meat, where that could be what people are living on because it is getting so expensive over here, just is insane.
Yeah. So, look, I'm of the belief, I'm more of a creationist than an evolutionist. But if we look at this as being evolution, it's the same here. So we have some native birds here and we have endemic birds. The native birds have been here for like over 100 years. It could be the fantail. I can't think of a couple of the other species, but they're considered natives, right? Because they've been here a while. But they're not considered to have an impact on the environment or anything like that. But some of these animals have been here for over 100 years. Deer were introduced into New Zealand in the 1800s. Possums soon after. In my opinion, the possums are not a big issue. They can be managed easily enough in this country by ground management. There was a fur industry, but a lot of people object to that. But whatever the thing is, it's about targeting. And I think management and adaptation to these animals is the best way to go forward, not mass poisoning. It gets out of control, as you say. It's a lot of wastage, but it's dangerous, and you don't know where it ends, you see, and you don't know the impact you're having on native wildlife. You really have to care about the native wildlife. For example, a deer and a goat in your outback, what's the impact it's going to have? It's going to eat some stuff. Deer are light browsers. Goats are a bit more rough, but they'll, eat back some of that nasty stuff. But if you have poisoned goats and deer in the environment, it's a far bigger impact. So that's something that you need to look at. So it's management, adaptation, and consider it as evolution. We all hear about evolution. Well, the world's getting smaller. The animals are here. We just need to try and manage them, I think, and steer away from eradication. It's just not rational.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was listening to a podcast with Joe Rogan and Adam Greentree the other day, and they were looking at Aboriginal artwork, and on there was some drawings of potential, they look like deer, to be honest, that Aboriginal people had drawn before white settlers had arrived in Australia. And it was like, well, we don't know how long back, we weren't there. We're guessing for a lot of these things, and you do have to wonder what species were here, what species weren't. There's been so many different species over time. So that plays an element to it. I'm really confused in this country. I love Australia, don't get me wrong, but I'm super confused. We talk about eradicating, the deer and the goats, but we are happy to keep horses on the landscape, even though they're not native, because there's some misinformation out there that they came back from the wars, and that's the genetic lineage that are up in the snowy mountains of New South Wales and Vic High Country. Then we talk about trout, and I want to talk to you about trout because we breed them to release them here, which is very interesting, seeing that technically they are an introduced species and we're more than happy to profit off that and push that out into the landscape. But over there, this is another concern because I do like trout, and one of my favorite things to eat is smoked trout. Over there, you had a video about trout being mass poisoned. How did that all work?
Well, that was really just to identify the issue where the poison baits are dropped directly into the waterways. Trout will uptake some of those cereal baits, but what was happening is they'd target rats and mice with the aerial operations. The mice tended to gravitate towards the waterways, jump into the waterways while they were poisoned, and the trout were eating them. And so there was an impact on, and that's that slow latent period thing. Trout can be actually carriers of 1080 poison within their system. They have a big tolerance for the poison, apparently, and fishermen can catch the trout and take trout and potentially be sublethally poisoned. So it was about raising that issue, and that's what's happening here in New Zealand. Trout, like you say, release trout here as well. It's a big industry. Trout fishing in New Zealand's fantastic. Some fantastic rivers, and that needs to be protected as well. But over here, when there's an aerial operation, it goes through the waterways and the forests. So no one really knows where the poison ends up. And so that's the idea of raising that issue with those trout. And there's been some research on trout. I think it was included in that clip, which is interesting for people who are interested in fishing in areas where they use poison.
Yeah, most definitely. It was one that caught my eye. And even when you had in there that the Department of Conservation said that the trout trace levels were over the limits that people should consume.
Yep. So, look, you mentioned the Food Standard Authority, whatever they are. Yeah.
Yep.
Some of their ratings are not good enough. It's just a bit too. They're targeting 1080 poison is toxic at very low levels, and especially to infants, etc. So if a mother is eating a slightly contaminated animal or fish or whatever, that it can impact on the unborn. So there's not enough research done into that. So yeah, there's got to be more care taken.
Well, on that, when you talked about the 2.5 baits for an adult human, which equates to 30 grams, that's for an adult human. So if you're talking a toddler that eats game meat, my kid eats game meat and he's 3.
Yep.
I've got 2 1-year-old twins who they will probably be dabbling in that as well. That concerns me again because there's not, as far as I'm aware, I couldn't find any figures of what the toxicity level should be for toddlers or smaller people.
No. So here in New Zealand, there's 1080 poison bait, which is aerially dropped, and then there's brodifacoum poison, which is in the same cereal, and that's used in bait stations, and it's used widely in some areas. And the issue with that is it kills the possums, it kills the rats that eat from the bait stations, but the pigs uptake those. The pigs eat the rats and the possums, and they become contaminated. And so you have this effect over here where there's no warnings really for those bait stationed areas, and people are harvesting pigs and taking away pigs that aren't fatally poisoned, because brodifacoum is a different poison to 1080. They can tolerate more of it, but it's retained in their bodies, the brodifacoum, and it builds up over time and eventually kills them and they bleed to death. So it's an anticoagulant poison. So that's a poison that's used in this country, and it's a sublethal poison, if you like, that accesses the food chain much easier than 1080. So it's the risks. I don't eat wild food in New Zealand, apart from areas where we just know there's no poison. So we just won't go any. Most of the areas in New Zealand, most of the state forests and the national parks are now poisoned, 80%. Every 3 years, it's a sort of a 3-year cycle, 2 to 3 year cycle, and it's just ongoing and increasing.
Yeah, it's crazy to think such a accomplished hunter such as yourself and a family lineage of hunting, because your dad was a guide, I believe, and that's how you and your brother sort of got into it and started down that track.
Yeah, father was a professional deer hunter in the Urewera National Park for many years, and so he would the way he made money was to shoot deer, carry them out of New Zealand's rugged country, the Urewera National Park, which is all forest, steep country, wet, lonely. But that's what he'd do, hunt them, carry them out on his back and sell them. And that's what he loved. He liked the outdoor life, and he was good at it. It always amazes us how he did it. And that was his life. And so, yeah, we just grew up and learned from him. And but interestingly, the Urewera National Park is one of the few areas that most of it hasn't been poisoned yet. And that's one of the few areas where we find the great kiwi populations, wild kiwi, and all of the other native species that should be there are still there. And there's the odd possum, the odd deer, the odd pig, just all in low numbers now. They seem to level themselves out. And it's a fantastic forest without poison.
It's interesting. Some people will say that's anecdotal evidence, but it is, but like boots on the ground that have been on the landscape and seen it for a long time.
Yes, observation is a big part of science. You can have all the theory you like in the science, and I keep saying it to these guys that present this research. It's theoretical. They make these assumptions, and then I say, well, we need to go out and check this into the actual field. You've got to check it, and when you go out there to check it, it doesn't line up. It's not linear. It's the opposite of what they say. So observation is a big part of this. And it's the only way you really get to know what the outcomes are going to be. And so what we've done over the years, we've been filming, and we've filmed a lot of stuff. We've got a long list of 1080 films and documentaries, short films. A lot of work's gone into that, and we have a lot of work in the hunting field as well. These days, we mainly roar our stags in over here and to the camera and let them go, let them run and let someone else have a go at them. But we're releasing some more footage soon too on our YouTube channel, which people will enjoy. But yeah, we love to see the wildlife in the forests because the forests can manage it. It doesn't need to be just birds. These animals have been there for years, especially in this country, and in my opinion, they should be made native. Some of them, especially the deer.
I always sort of look at it from I try and take a step back and look at the pros and the cons from all different angles, from people that would be hunters, people that are not really caring, and then people who are against, more the animal activism side of things. And one of the things I don't think people tend to do is think about managing the species. Like they talk about kangaroos and and their population numbers and whatnot, but they also don't take into account that they compare it to pre-sort of colonization when there wasn't farmland. And what happens when we have pasture and farmland is kangaroos, that's a really great feed source. They're going to overpopulate the area. They need to be controlled, and we don't tend to have the predators on the landscape to do that other than humans, and yet we're not really allowed to. Yes, there's tags and things like that, but it's very sort of micromanaged. And then you could also argue about the crocodiles up north, is that they've become a protected species and they're just out of control, the numbers that are up there now. It's very interesting when you hear about all these things. And if you're out there listening, guys, I'll have all the links on the podcast on the show notes for Clyde and the Graf Boys and TV Wild. I'll have it all up there, plus their website, so you'll be able to click over and go straight over there to access their stuff. On that, one of the videos I was watching, geez, I loved how you called in a red stag. and he came barreling in, got very, very close to your brother, I think it was, and saw his cheeks before he took off. But that was really cool. I haven't had the experience of hearing a red stag roar in person yet. I've only on what I've seen on YouTube and TV. So I'm hopefully might get the chance to get out there and hear one this year. Or sorry, next year, I should say.
Yeah, next year in March, April, May. Nothing like it. We never get sick of it, and the closer the better. That's what we do, And if a stag attacks us, Steve usually has the camera, and I say, just keep filming. It's got to be good, So we've got some good footage coming up. So we're roaring the stags into a few meters. In New Zealand, the stags are very sort of sensitive, very scary. They're hunted all year round. Anyone can hunt them. You can come over to New Zealand, get a permit at the Department of Conservation for no cost to hunt deer on public land, and away you go. America, of course, we look at Australia, we look at New Zealand. America has a high number of deer. America has great deer, elk and whitetail and moose, but you don't hear them bleating on about their deer, do you? They've got their tag systems. They've got their systems sorted out. They've got massive country there, but the deer aren't out of control. They don't complain about that. I know that you could say they're native there, but the point is, I think a system of, the government maybe in Australia could consider allowing hunters, whether it's a tag system or whether you pay, however it is, to go into the national parks, go hunting, and shoot a few animals and keep the population in check. That's the best way. That's the friendly way of doing it. That's going to be the best for the best outcome for the wildlife and the people. You go down the road of poison, and I promise there's going to be problems. There's going to be cover-ups. There's going to be issues. There could be terrible things that can happen. So I just hope you don't go down that road. I know that 1080 is used in Australia. Nothing like it is in New Zealand, but it's still used there, and it's not a good way of management, in my opinion.
I couldn't agree with you more. I've been a very big vocal advocate of the North American conservation model and their tag system. And that is generally what someone will say in response to that is that, deer are native over there. And it's like, yes, they're native over there, but they're now here. They're pretty well on the ground. To be able to remove them is going to be near impossible. So why not change the thinking and go, well, let's use them as a resource. Let's use a tag system in national parks, open it up to hunters, especially that, on a previous podcast, I had Mark Latham, who was running as a political candidate over here. And one of the things he was saying is open the national parks. And he had some stats that 90% of national parks weren't really used. I can't remember exactly, so don't quote me on that. But that is a way of actually having public lands utilised and accessed by people who are paying taxes. Then you've got the opportunities where, as I mentioned before, maybe a bait station, you could shoot off the bait station. It's not hunting per se, but hey, at the end of the day, we're trying to keep numbers down and the meat's going to be utilised and money's going to get put back into the system for conservation. That's very similar to what's happening in North America. For me, there is so much opportunity, but we just don't seem to be getting thought about. It just seems to be, hey, let's go down this poison route because it's quick and easy. And I'm guessing it's cost effective because we got some figures on how much aerial culling costs, and it's not cheap, but having someone just fly over with a helicopter and just dump baits, and those baits stay on the landscape for a pretty long time, it's more cost effective than an aerial culler. I am very, very concerned that this is where it will go and that we're not doing enough as hunters and conservationists and even environmentalists to oppose this happening here in Australia and learning from what's going on in New Zealand. But that also, then I look at over there what's going on and exactly what you're saying, that you're very vocal and I love the work that you're doing and the content that you're producing and putting out there. But it's not backed up by the government, that there's that disparity between yourself and what you're seeing on the landscape and what they are. And you probably find that they're probably sitting in an office in a desk that they're never been out on the landscape and they have no idea, when it's very clear from your footage, you can see what animals are eating the 1080 baits.
Yeah. So that is the case. Most of the people involved with making the decisions have never stepped foot off a track in their lives, and they just dismiss as so-called anecdotal evidence. But the evidence, I say, that is so important, which is out there in the field. But I do think something's going to need to be done in Australia. You're going to have to come up with some sort of management plan. Deer will, they love the landscape there. They do well, and they breed slowly to start with. But once they get into higher numbers, those populations increase quite quickly. So management, you need to get on top of the management, but you need to do it in a clean, environmentally friendly way and a community-friendly way, because what the poison does is it does cause division among your communities. People are impacted with poisoning incidents, and it's not a good outcome, as we see here in New Zealand. So on that note, Matt, thank you for the opportunity to have a chat, and you'll put the website stuff up there, our website, tv-wild.com.
I will indeed.
The Graf Boys YouTube channel, Graf Boys being 1F, and I look forward to getting to Australia soon.
Clyde, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I will put everything up there for all our listeners to access it, and keep producing such great quality content and the documentaries and things that you're doing. And I hope to see some of that from over here in Australia in the future, mate.
Yeah, well, it's had a big impact on us over here. We're blacklisted from a lot of stuff, and it comes with the territory, unfortunately, when you're up against powerful organisations. But we believe what we've done is the right thing to do: raise awareness, show the truth, and that's where we are. So we've got a few years hopefully left in this to produce some more outdoor stuff, and that's what we hope to do. Let's hope it's not all about battling against these poisons.
No, look, fantastic, and I wish you all the best in the future with it. Again, thanks for coming on the show, and all you can do is keep flying the flag and doing the best you can out there in the community. So thank you again, and good luck with it.
And thanks for that, and keep an eye out for our new video clips that we'll load soon before the Raw. And enjoy.
I most definitely will, and I'm sure our listeners will too. All right, Clyde, thanks for that. And listeners, bye for now. If you have a topic, guest, question, or any gear that you want to hear about on the podcast, shoot us an email, australianhuntingandbeyond@gmail.com. Alternatively, find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All the links are in the show notes. If you haven't already, make sure you give us a review and subscribe to our podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.